Zakhar Protsiuk is the Chief Operating Officer at the Kyiv Independent and co-founder at The Fix Media. Zakhar is an innovator in the media industry and is helping to shake up the technologies and practices of modern journalism. His role at the Kyiv Independent is pivotal for its success, commercial success, and it's become an important voice for democracy, transparency, civil society, and human rights from the very start of Russia's full-scale invasion. After being established just a few months before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kyiv Independent had developed a good revenue model, but needed to pivot very quickly because of the changes brought about by the war. The Kyiv Independent is notable for its fearless journalism and does not hold back from running corruption investigations and critiquing the government, even in time of war, and when the extraordinary pressures are being felt from a hostile information environment. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to see more of the incredible speakers that we feature, and do please consider becoming a patron or buy me a coffee to help support the work of the channel and the many future events that we are planning in support of Ukraine. Zakhar, I'm delighted to welcome you.
Thank you. Great to be here, Jonathan.
You obviously, we're going to talk about sort of commercial models. Let's start with that, because not only was the start of the full-scale war a very visceral and personal experience for many people, it's also extremely challenging commercially to many businesses, not least journalism, where, let's say, ad revenues came under extreme pressure after the war began.
I mean, I agree. There was a lot of pressure, and I think running a media organization in Ukraine was never for the faint of hearts, right? Even before the full-scale invasion, and that one made things much more complicated. If you're asking me about the experience that the Kyiv Independent had, so the way it was for us is that Kyiv Independent was established in November 2021, just a few months before the full-scale invasion, when the owner of the previous biggest English language publication here in Ukraine called Kyiv Post fired the whole team because that was hurting his main business. He thought that he doesn't control his assets. And that's kind of after that, the newsroom of Kyiv Post partnered with a consulting company called Genomics, and we co-founded the Kyiv Independent. So back then I was working in Genomics consultancy. And I think the idea of making sure that there is a financial sustainability for the Kyiv Independent was like right at the beginning, because that is the only really way, like how you can be independent, right? If you don't make money for yourself, then there is some dependency, whether it's an owner, whether it's like you need to find some grants. There is anyway like this constant urge to fill that gap. So I think what we believe in is the only way to be truly independent is to make money for yourself. So that was very important for us at the beginning, and what we put our bet on is that we want to build the organization that is reader revenue first. So the support from the readers is at the heart of how we finance our work, and it worked. That is how it works for us now. Right now, the majority of our revenue comes from the support of our readers, and it's been a great journey and a lot of learnings and a lot of sometimes harder moments, sometimes better moments, but that is what allows us right now to say that we are financially sustainable.
And the audience themselves, I mean, this is an area I'm not entirely sure of. I have previously interviewed the English language editor of the English language version of Ukrainska Pravda, and the English version has overtaken the Ukrainian version in terms of circulation, I think, for the first time, which was interesting. But do you have a mixture of English-speaking sort of expats or foreigners in Ukraine, or is there a high percentage of English-speaking Ukrainians who consume your media as well?
So if you're asking about who reads the Kyiv Independent, Kyiv Independent, its main target audience are people outside of Ukraine. We don't have a Ukrainian version. We create our content and our journalism only in English. So the majority of our readers are the people outside of Ukraine. That's how it landed. So it's I would say around 40% are people from the United States. And then there is a long tail of United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Scandinavia. Ukraine is at the level of that long tail. So it's like 5 to 7% of our audience. Yeah, that is so that is the focus for us. There is obviously, I would say, for those foreigners in Ukraine, we matter more, and then we see like the outsized level of probably engagement from them. But overall readership is the people out in countries outside of Ukraine.
That's fascinating. So the diaspora, I guess a lot of the diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora, are very hooked into what's happening in Ukraine. Some of them will be fluent enough in Ukrainian to read domestic media, but I'm guessing out of that percentage, there will be some of the diaspora who get their information from your publication.
Yeah, so I think diaspora is one of the important, I would say, kind of audience groups that we try to cater, and we try to make sure that we fill their needs. Although I would say their size in proportion to our overall readership before the full-scale invasion and now changed, and now it's smaller percentage. There are much bigger amount of people now who didn't really have any connection with Ukraine before, but who wants to consume the information from us because we are on the ground, we are faster, we are, we are giving them that they are looking for, right? Of a publication out of Ukraine covering this war.
And this is an interesting question because there's a, I won't say similar publication, but there's a publication in Moscow called the Moscow Times. I regularly, when I'm doing a news roundup, I'll look at your publication and the Moscow Times as my two go-to sources because it runs a lot of stories highly critical of the government. It has a lot of local detail, which you would never normally see in the Western media. The same with your publication, lots of detail you would never, ever find, even in serious newspapers in the West. Now, the Moscow Times is almost completely aimed at English-speaking expats. I think the local population who read it is minute. If that was different, you could be assured that it would be shut down in 5 seconds by the Moscow authorities. If we flip that, though, is there any pressure at all on the work you do from Ukrainian authorities? Because some of your reporting is extremely open and transparent. You do investigations, you do work that is highly objective. That means it's also sometimes critical of the government as well. Is this a bit of a tightrope, or is it not such an issue for you as it, say, would be for the Moscow Times?
I mean, I think it's safe to say that we exist in two different realities, right? Like Ukraine is a developing but a functioning democracy, right? You can run a media organization here that will be critical to the government. It's not about us, right? Like they don't position ourselves as an opposition to something, but you can run an objective publication and you might not be liked, but no one would, would close your website. At least now, right? Like it used to be worse in the early 2000s, right? There were a lot of cases when there was a huge pressure on journalists. Journalists were killed. For example, Georgy Kongadze, the founder of Ukrainska Pravda, which you said you interviewed, he was killed for his work. So, but that situation improved, and I would say right now, I wouldn't say that is an issue that is at the top of our agenda. There are some stories that we hear some feedback that they don't some people in the government and power don't like, but there is no, I wouldn't say this is something that we are afraid of, or and that is the benefit of being in a democracy.
And these values of tolerance, discomfort, yes, but tolerance for media stories, is that, do you think, I mean, this is quite a difficult question, I think, is that part of a genuine shift in the values of society? Or is there a calculation here that they don't want to displease Western partners and allies, and therefore we can't behave like this? Is there a risk of a reversion, perhaps, to older behaviors one assumes when the war is over and is won in Ukraine's favor. I mean, that is the assumption that almost everyone on this channel buys into. Is there a risk of reversion to some of these older values, or do you see further progress being made in terms of media transparency and evolution?
So I would say that there was a lot of genuine progress, like you said, in the last 10 years, especially after 2014. There was a lot of change, and I think that change was for the better. The amount of independent media that were founded in the country significantly increased, and I think that trend is still like happening. So my assessment, I would say, is quite positive. Ukraine was like, if you're looking for the comparison between Ukraine and Russia, I would say even 20 years ago, it was never, I would say, never something similar. Ukrainian civil society was always had like a bit of a, I would say, stronger character, and that fight for their rights. And that was seen in a number of revolutions here in Ukraine, led by the civil society, not just Maidan in 2014. It was Maidan in 2004, right? There was the revolution like in 1990, right? The maybe less known one, but still present. So I think the picture was just like the culture was slightly better from other countries from the Soviet Union, but instead of taking a downward trend, Ukraine took an upward trend in improving that. And with its up and downs, right? When Viktor Yanukovych came to power in 2010, that was definitely a down, not an up. But we went through that, and I think that's why I'm positive, right? And the war is a challenge. But I would say the way media are run right now is still shows that you can have independent media even during war, and you can still be objective and still do your like good work even in the circumstances like this.
And I find this an absolutely fascinating area because you mentioned 2014. Maidan obviously is one of several revolutions, but it does seem to be a pivotal moment for a younger generation of journalists and civil society activists. Speaking to Olga Tarkaryuk, independent journalist, and speaking also to Evgen Fitchenko, who is key in the Kyiv Mikhail Academy and developing the School of Journalism there. They both said that there was a movement after Maidan to basically just start from scratch, to go out and look at what the best journalist schools around the world are doing, sweep out entirely the old Soviet methods. And unfortunately, that almost certainly meant sweeping out a lot of the old teachers and people of the old generation and just starting completely afresh. Do you have much experience of that process? And do you think that post-Maidan almost revolution in journalism was critical in creating the foundations for something like the Kyiv Independent?
I think Maidan definitely played a very important role, and it was a start for many great media organizations that were born after. For example, Hromadske, which was essentially kind of the symbol of those days, was a TV, but a new type of a TV, right? That was founded during Maidan, and this organization kept on developing. And I think that's a great example of a media born after Maidan. I think the big factor of the publications that were born after is. Like you said, probably, I think that is a good point of looking for practices to the West, right? Or how Western media run their publications, and not just in terms of standards of journalism, but also in terms of how do they finance their work, what are the business models behind their publications, right? That was very critical. I think the factor of the significantly increased amount of donor support also played a big role, right? There were a number of organizations that started investing in media and supporting them with grants. And I mean, I can talk a lot about that. There are some risks to that kind of model, right? Like, because grants they work in cycles, they come to a country, they stay there for some point, and then they leave, right? And if media don't manage to adapt, then they sometimes are left very vulnerable. So there are some risks, but there are also lots of benefits from that grant support, and I think it made possible the existence of many publications that otherwise would not be possible, and they were very helpful for the Ukrainian democracy. So I mean, to summarize it, I think I agree, and Maidan, like in many other aspects of life, it's not that it created something new, but it accelerated things by such a big margin that no one was expecting. And I think the same could be said about the full-scale invasion. Many of the things that were happening in the society, they just accelerated, like transition from part of the society from Russian language to Ukrainian, like accelerated, right? The understanding of what Russia is, right? That was, slowly moving in that direction, and then significantly accelerated after 2013, and then, through the roof in 2022. So my take is it just accelerated a lot of trends that were there and made them faster.
And of course, Western media is not immune from some of the struggles you've talked about, the influence of owners of various media. I would even dare, I'd even call it oligarchical influence in some instances. Rupert Murdoch is nothing if he's not a kind of oligarch figure who wields huge power. And of course, there are commercial challenges. Again, in the UK media environment, you see, I would say in certain papers, you see often the tailoring of stories to a particular audience and their political perspectives, as opposed to what I would consider a more objective, bipartisan kind of approach. So clearly, there are learnings there, but we haven't necessarily taken on those learnings ourselves. So how would you sort of compare the health and the sort of ecosystem of the print media in Ukraine to, say, sort of UK environment, for instance?
Well, I would start by saying that there is pretty much like the print media in Ukraine are almost non-existent, right? No one is in print. There is like
I should have said digital/print, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
My age.
I mean, I was in London a few months ago, and I was fascinated to see how people still have print in their hands. And I think you had like some even like place for throwing away specifically newspapers on the street. I was like, wow, is that really a thing? Ukraine went through that trend much faster. There is no almost like print. There is not. I don't really know any big independent media that is print first. But I mean, I think in terms of comparing those two markets, there is a few big differences. The first one is just the expectation that the audience from the readers in UK that you have to pay for news is much higher, right? Because of that long tradition. And the switch from like you used to pay for print, right? You started paying for digital. It was like almost kind of, there was a gap in early 2000s, right, when everything was free, and but then it stopped quickly, and the media understood that you have to put your content behind the paywall, right? So in that tradition of paying for news, it was, I think, much better compared to Ukraine, where no one was paying for news. During the Soviet period of time, those like papers were free, right? And then when they moved to digital, everything is free. And even now, by this point, there is pretty much no tradition of paying for news. There's one or two big publications that are experimenting with paywalls. One of them is called Новое Время, or New Voice. They rebranded themselves, I'm sorry. And the Ukrainian Forbes. I think the rest, no one is even trying. So that is definitely a big distinction that I would highlight. And then I think, I mean, in general, right, it's not just about the culture of media, it's about the culture of how other stakeholders interact with media. I think just that culture of, that the government is inviting the press for and is answering their appeals, that is giving them comments, that kind of stuff was something that is developing in Ukraine. There are lots of problems with that, and I think right now there is some issues with that, because I think in the last few years, many people in the government in Ukraine understood that you can circumvent media and talk directly to the audience, right? So you don't, like, you can have a great Telegram channel or a Facebook page or YouTube channel. You don't exactly need media. So I think their willingness to cooperate and to talk didn't really improve that much. And I think that trend got even exacerbated during the full-scale invasion, because Ukrainian government is trying to talk to media, but in a very kind of targeted way. So they clearly, maybe you noticed, aggressively prioritize Western media over like giving comments. And I mean, I understand why, right? But their willingness to talk to Ukrainian media was I would say in many cases, like not that high, right? And that is something to keep in mind. I think I kind of got a bit off topic.
That's an interesting point, though. That's an interesting point. I mean, there's another aspect to that, and it comes off print media and it gets into the sort of digital video sphere. But you have very noticeable spokesmen like Padelek, who will speak in Russian, very much to a Russian oppositional audience, opposition in inverted commas. So he does, a lot of interviews in that media forum. In the good old days where you had Arestovich sort of doing his thing. Again, huge amount of focus there on a Russian-speaking, even say Russophone audience there. It's interesting you say, yeah, the Western media are prioritized. That's probably not surprising, though, given the dependency on aid to allies and the need to project a sort of positive, progressive image of the Ukrainian government, and a united image as well.
No, I agree. I don't think that is something surprising, and probably from their perspective, a smart thing to do. I think that to challenge that a bit, I think what happened is that so when Russia invaded Ukraine, what happened is that all big TV channels were united into one big marathon, it's called, right? Like the media marathon. So there was one, instead of having, let's say, a few different streams of information on TV, there was one. And for a long period of time, TV was the primary way of how people here in Ukraine consume news. And I think and there was also a very strong, unity, and it's still there, but to those levels that were there, hard to bring it back. So I think for a moment they just felt that they don't really need to talk that much to the home audience, and it's fine, and it's under control, right? And we have to focus on audiences in other countries, which probably for some time was the case. But I think what happened is that marathon, right, like that kind of lost its relevance just because people got a bit disengaged. And I think those there was a huge transition in how people started consuming their news. Telegram, which was already a thing before the full-scale invasion, got even bigger. And then I think I saw a recent survey, I think it overtook digital, like Telegram, just like regular websites, as a way to consume news in Ukraine, which it's hard to believe, but could be the case, right? Like the amount of information there and that habit of people looking their Telegram first to see what's happening in their messengers. That is something that I think for them it's hard to manage, right? Because when you have one big marathon to weave, right, like you have it under control, but then people get disengaged, so you don't really have one place where people are consuming your news. And I think that there is a point of I would say of rethinking how to talk to the local to Ukrainian audiences, how to keep them motivated, how to keep the morale high, right? All of those questions I think are definitely like on the top of their agenda.
And that's another source. I mean, when I look at the sort of sources for the kind of coverage I do, there is a little bit. So Times Radio is one that I'll watch a lot of stuff, very similar format to what the sort of interviews I'm doing, but that's only a minority. I mean, I will tend to watch Russian language sources in the majority. And of course, some of the output of the marathon and various sort of interview formats that come out of that is part of it. But do you think that the TV format and the marathon format in particular, do they have as much resources and ability to really do the sort of probing critical stories that you do? Or are there editorial or resource limitations on doing, really sort of critical investigative type journalism?
I think there's some great stuff that is done there. For example, Suspilne, which is the national broadcaster in Ukraine, is doing, I think, a lot of good work, and their investigations on war crimes are quite impressive. So there is, and they are part of the marathon, right, as the national broadcaster. So I think there is some of that, but in my opinion, the majority of that kind of breaking journalism investigations probably is happening in the digital sphere right now, in my opinion. So like there are lots of great investigative publications in Ukraine that are like, for example, Schema, which is part of the Radio Free Europe initiative in Ukraine, and they are doing lots of investigations into Russians and also into Ukraine, right? So in my opinion, that's kind of the main weight is probably in the of that kind of journalism is in the hands of digital media right now.
And another sort of, I would say, weakness of the Western media, and this is even, the quality of publications, they tend to fall into a trap. It's a sort of narrative trap of trying to look for heroes and villains, trying to turn complex stories into much more simple narratives, and at its worst, trying to find, angels and devils and fit everything into that kind of format. I think the reporting on Hamas Israel has absolutely fallen into that trap, with a lot of assumptions and a lot of incorrect narratives being placed over a complex reality. Is that a trap which the Ukrainian media also is that a risk also in your media sphere, or is Ukrainian culture less prone to looking for these, I would say, sort of caricatured sort of narratives and interpretations of events?
I think that the explanation here is very simple, right? Like there is a reason why there are lots of things that are probably will look funny to Ukrainians, but they get reported by Western media. Is that because of that significant increase in demand in what's happening in Ukraine and them moving into covering Ukraine? So I think Ukrainians media, they just don't fall into those traps because they went through them for years. They're doing this all the time, right? Like for decades before. And I think that is where how Kyiv Independent differentiates itself, right, from other publications, is that we are based in Kiev. We are not coming here to report and then we come back to somewhere, right? We are based here. Our reporters live in Ukraine, right? The majority of them live in Ukraine, and it doesn't not just Ukrainians. Also, that we have amazing reporters from different countries, like from Australia, from Japan, but they are based in Ukraine, and they have much more context and much more, I would say, insight. They speak the languages, and that is what allows us to create our reporting for Western audience, for people who want to consume content in English, but they want to dig deeper and want to probably, want to have a bit of a more rounded picture of what's happening, right? That said, there's tremendous amount of amazing reporting done by publications from UK, US, right? There is, I think, lots of incredible work which which we should definitely appreciate, right? But there is also that kind of, it's ebb and flows. Like they were interested in Ukraine for some time. Right now, there is a focus on what's happening in Middle East, right? And I think this is how we differentiate ourselves. Is that for us, it's not something that we will move from as a topic. We're gonna stay deep on this, and we're gonna cover it. And while other publications kind of make their teams smaller in Ukraine, we increase our team and we invest. For example, recently we opened a new department in the Kyiv Independent called War Crimes Investigations Unit. And this is a separate department of amazing award-winning Ukrainian journalists who are investigating war crimes in the form of documentaries. And that is, for me, a great example of like why we are different and why I think the place where we try to be among other media is justified.
Now, a little plug there. I would definitely love to speak to your lead correspondent on that team. I have done interviews with truth hounds much earlier on in the war, and that is again a topic which does not get nearly enough coverage. Similarly, the topic of the kidnapped children, and this brings me on to the fine line between activism and journalism, because it seems to me, or you're also doing documentaries, so bullet holes is an interesting one I'd like to ask you about, but it seems that you're able to blend activism with objective journalism, whereas perhaps more in the Western media sphere, that combination might look a little bit sort of suspect, a little partisan. Is the main difference there because journalism is an act of survival in Ukraine? Without independent journalism, essentially Russia could well overrun the information sphere, could overrun the country, and could eradicate all the values associated with Ukrainian nation and language. So is it true that journalism has that kind of edge and importance to survival, which it just doesn't have, or which people have forgotten about perhaps in the West?
Let me think how to unpack that question. Is journalism something that has to survive? And if something that would not survive if Russia comes in, of course, right? Like there would be no independent journalism if Russia occupies Ukraine. I think that's out of the question. I mean, to that question of, I think, let me maybe answer in broader terms and let me know if that's what you were looking for. Look, the way we think about this, Kyiv Independent is the Ukrainian publication, and we do have a position, right? And our position, you can see them in our editorials, which we publish regularly, and it's out in the open, and this is signed. This is an opinion of our newsroom, right? And I think it's important for us that the world understand that we have this position. That said, our reporting has to remain objective, and that has to not be in hands of, let's say, we are not broadcasting government news, right? And I think the investigations that we had is also, like, I think is a proof that we preserve our independence. So that is kind of how we try to approach it. I think the reality of this war is that, unfortunately, I mean, it's incredible. Like, it's rarely there are wars that are so clear, right? Like, in the sense of who is the aggressor, who is the party that is getting invaded, right? It's rarely getting so clear. So I think, just in a sense, from the journalist perspective, I don't think we face the challenges that could have been faced by some in the other wars. For us, it's even, I think, is a bit easier, just because if you do facts, right, you just focus on facts. The facts show the facts are very clear, right? In this case, for me, I think that is one of them. That is the argument I usually try to say when I get asked by this question.
And does that also mean that creating a distinction between the work of journalists and what we see in the Russian information sphere, is that a really clear definition to create? Because as I've watched, you've got Solovyov and got Simonyan, and they're clear kind of propagandists. But then behind them, you have a whole ecosystem of, people on the ground, independent thinkers, agents and assets. You have lots and lots, many thousands of journalists or quasi-journalists, in that informational environment in Russia. For you, is there a very, very clear distinction from what you're doing or your colleagues are doing and what this entire ecosystem of disinformation, with all the different roles that it has within the Russian information sphere? I mean, it's easy to distinguish between the pure propagandists, but you have a lot of, other people who call themselves journalists in Russia, shifting information around, publishing information which is not pure propaganda. Have you got a clear distinction between, the journalism that your colleagues do and that sort of hybrid informational sphere that you find in Russia?
I mean, I think the distinctions are very clear, and I mean, it's hard to put everything under one kind of roof. There are lots of stuff happening there, but I think Russian journalism failed as an institution. They didn't prevent what happened, and I think there are lots of questions to their efficiency, in my opinion. That is how I try to think about this. Look, I think what I said again, right? We are not a propaganda, right? We are a journalism organization that was here before the war. We are not a war project. We're gonna stay here after the war, and we have a very clear mission of telling the world what's happening in Ukraine and the wider region, right? And that is the main mission. So the only key stakeholder we serve is our audience, right? And especially those our members who are supporting the existence of our organizations, right? So that is the kind of how we think about our role, right? And what's happening in Russia is, I think it's a mess. It's very hard for me to distinguish, to compare it.
And I won't even ask you to, what the solution to that is, because one, it's unfair, and two, I don't think anyone has a clear solution. But I think a much clearer challenge is that you're projecting to an international audience. You're providing information, verifiable information, which is of very high quality. The problem is, primitive as they are, some of Russia's propaganda narratives do actually work. They do work in different parts of the world, not with everybody and not with all countries. So using a label like Global South, there's going to be exceptions. There are countries where Russian propaganda works less. There are places where governments have condemned Russia, even in those regions. What do you think both Ukrainian and Western journalism could do more to try and dispel these propaganda narratives that are still having traction, in Africa, South America, India, China, and other places?
No, I think that is a challenge that is incredibly big, and I think like the way you've phrased it is it's a very, like, I would say, like, soft way of saying it. I think Russian propaganda is winning there, and in terms of what we can do, there is a big need, I think, to show how this war is affecting those communities and show it from their perspective, right? And it is affecting them for sure, right? Like the grain to Africa, or the consequences of how this war would affect the security infrastructure in Asia, right? And the Taiwan and China, right? Those consequences, there are lots of them, right? Russian weapons that prove themselves very unreliable, and then India, which was relying on Russian military for so long now, understands that they have to restructure the whole military apparatus, right? Like, those influences are lots of them, and I think investing more into doing the journalism, but also helping publications there in those countries to validate some stuff, right? To help them get through those Russian disinformation, but help them tell those stories from their perspective is, I think, very important. And we at the Kyiv Independent been thinking about this, and we are actually now working on a kind of a partnership project where we would partner with publications in countries like India and Southeast Asia, and try to do a bit of a, don't try to capture. We're not going to try to capture their audiences, but we're going to try to help those publications when they cover something about Ukraine to avoid some of the pitfalls. And this is the mission that we had already for Western publications. There are lots of journalists who report on Ukraine who read us before they report, and it's an important mission for us to be that kind of filter, right, of Ukraine people who are from Ukraine who speak Ukrainian, who know the what's happening on the ground really well, but then they can convey that to the English language speaking world, right? We played that role for many publications already, and we want to maybe increase that role for those publications in other parts of the world for whom they were not referring to us that much, right? So that is one of the ideas. What we can do, and we hope doing more, and probably it's very important of uncovering, right, what Russia is for those countries, because for many of them there is a lot of, it's not something that they support Russia, they just don't really like the United States, right? Like there is, for many of them, it's a relations that is coming not from support to Russia, but from anything that the United States is touching that they don't like, right? But I think the work of explaining the world that making friends with Russia is not gonna help you, right? Like, and what's happening in Africa, right, with the influence of Wagner, I think, is a great example. I don't think it helps anyone there, and working on that could be also I think one of the angles. Yeah, two ideas.
Another idea, perhaps, and I know there's lots of stuff going on around this, but as well as news media, the sort of soft cultural power is important. So do you think also publications like Ukraina and those that deal with, cultural issues or cuisine or, whatever it happens to be, dance, art, literature, do you think these are going to play an increasingly important role in defining Ukraine and bolstering support for it around the world?
Yeah, no, I think showing Ukraine not just from the position of war, but also from the position of its culture, its connection with other regions is incredibly important, and that is, I think, definitely something that we should do more. We at the Kyiv Independent have, for example, the section which we launched last year called "Explaining Ukraine," where we try to kind of uncover some of those some myths about Ukraine, right? People want to know what about Chernobyl. Let's let them tell about Chernobyl and tell a bit more about it. But right, like, so use maybe the ways of what people knew about Ukraine before to introduce them to other things about Ukraine, which they didn't know before. So I think that is definitely a strategy. The way we try to do this. So at the Kyiv Independent, we recently relaunched our business desk. So now we have a great business editor on board and a business reporter, and we try to increase our coverage of business from Ukraine and give that new angle, right? That is, I think, very important and relevant, and will get even more relevant, especially during the reconstruction of Ukraine. And then we also have now a culture reporter that is, and apologies for that, there is our office dog being very loud, covering the culture. And also one of the missions we have is we have started doing book reviews, because are already a lot of books about Ukraine. There will be more of them, and some of them will be great, and some of them will be bullshit. And we want to be kind of help people understand that more. Yeah. So I think that's definitely about moving just from covering what's happening on the front line to other parts of Ukraine.
Yeah, and creating this impression that Ukrainians are not victims. I mean, this is I think the interesting thing right from the start of the war. I haven't met a single Ukrainian who wanted to be thought of as a victim, or who accepted that kind of label, whether they're refugees in this country or obviously having visited Ukraine itself. The media, however, often likes to paint people as victims. It fits into a stereotypical narrative that they think their readers will tune into. Have you noticed that as an issue in certain coverage of the war in Ukraine?
You mean how media
Yes,
position themselves?
yeah, they'll pick up on the victim stories, or they'll try to turn a story into one of victimhood. They won't necessarily cover in as much detail. I would say the more positive stories. For instance, last week, the Ukraine, regaining partial dominance of the Black Sea, huge strategic significance, and yet it didn't get nearly the kind of airtime that it ought to have done.
I think that probably less of a case for Ukrainian media and more of a case for foreign media covering Ukraine. Although, I mean, it's about the simplification, right? Like, I think there's lots of part of the coverage is very much like kind of victim focused and very taking Ukraine very from the kind of position of an object rather than a subject, right? And then there is also a coverage where, like, too rosy, too ambitious, without maybe increasing the expectations when they should not be increased, right? So striking that balance is very important. And yeah, this is something that we try to do.
And this is the last question. I think I've probably saved the most difficult one to last. It can be a short answer because I'm not sure there is a good answer to this. But when territories in the east are liberated, obviously Kherson, Kharkiv, or parts of Kharkiv were only occupied for a relatively short period of time, albeit very traumatic period. When it comes to Donbass and Crimea, even more so, these territories have been occupied since 2014. They've been subject not only to intensive Russian propaganda and the complete control of the information sphere, you've also had a generation of people who've gone through their schooling with, I would say, a propagandized version of history. What is the role of independent media when the time comes in, I would say, helping to reverse the brainwashing that must have taken place in these territories?
Yeah, that is indeed a very hard question and an incredibly big issue. The other aspect of that is, for example, the amount of Ukrainian kids that were kidnapped, and in Russia there are in tens of thousands, and they all go through like forceful schooling and re-education, the forceful re-education, and it will be very hard to fight for their souls and minds after. I don't really think that I have an answer to you. I think there should definitely be a very big and very well thought government effort to that. The role of media there would be in making sure that they try to talk to them, stay objective, stay independent, don't so they are not perceived as a threat, right? But more of a way to understand, right? Whether it's going to be a case or not, I don't know, but I think that is at least something we'll need to try to get to.
Well, Zakhar, what you and your colleagues are doing is extraordinary. It's a fantastic publication, which I recommend to everybody who is following the war and those who ought to be taking more of an interest in it. We pick out stories every week in a kind of news summary that we do on the channel. They're becoming increasingly popular. Hopefully people follow up on the articles when they see those videos as well. But I just wanted to thank you for your time, but also thank you for what you and your colleagues are doing and the inspirational work that you are doing, not just for Ukraine, but around the world for all those who are supportive of your struggle.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. It was a great pleasure.